We all have one thing in common, and that's that we all eat food. Keeps us alive, kind of the biology of nutrition, keeps us healthy in many cases. One of the things that I really like to do is be able to cook food and serve food to people that I love. So, for example, this is a plate of food I made at the Tufts campus in Telwar when we were there last year. One of the ways that we're different, though, is it's very unlikely that you eat exactly the same foods as somebody else. They might be similar, for example, in your household or with your family or in a particular community, but around the world we eat a lot of different ways. So there's this very personal side of food that often gets overlooked when we talk about diets and nutrition and even sustainability. And then you see headlines like this: "The way that we eat is killing us and the planet." And this was a recent headline in The Guardian. There are also a lot of other headlines, including some scientific articles that really implicate some of the ways that we eat and a litany of chronic diseases from diabetes to cancer. So there's also this tension between this very personal aspect of food and eating and the implication to the planet. And that's because there are 7.2 billion of us people on the planet. So I have my plate of food for dinner, but the impact is much, much bigger than that. And this is because there are so many people. This is not a trivial kind of academic thing. It is one of the biggest footprints of humankind on the planet. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this poster. It was a very famous poster from April of 1970, so 50 years ago. And it was from the first Earth Day. And it says, "We have met the enemy and he is us." And it was really about what we as the human population were doing to the environment, specifically around pollution. And around the same time as that, there was a pretty famous bumper sticker that said, "Think globally and act locally." And I think that's the way that we should be thinking about our choices that we make about food. How does it impact us individually, which is a very local decision, but also the planet. So what I'm going to talk about today is the linkage between these things. So here's the goal. Although I really think this is two goals. One is that we want healthy diets, and specifically we want healthy diets for everybody around the world, regardless of income or where they live. And we want the food for those diets to come from a sustainable food system, which has a number of components, and we'll talk about a few of those in the next couple of minutes. So I come to this question or this issue of sustainability very much from the agriculture side. So this is not a random picture of a person in a tractor that I found on the internet. This is me. It was in one of my previous careers. So I spent nearly 30 summers doing this kind of work, doing research that answered questions directly from farmers in the United States. And it was a real privilege because for most of that time, I also got to work directly with farmers. So the question of where does food come from is really something that I'm comfortable with because I've worked with many, many different types and sizes of farms across the United States. And this has really been the formative piece of my professional life, was the time that I spent being able to do this. And it influences the way that I approach my work, research, and teaching at Tufts. Now, agriculture, as I mentioned earlier, has a big impact, but it also looks very different depending on where you are. It looks different in the way it works, and it looks different in scale. So here's an example from Southeast Asia of a very small rice paddy. This rice paddy is maybe 50 feet by 100 feet. And working that to prepare it for planting takes two people that you can see that are working and a fairly large oxen that's pulling a very small plow. So those characteristics about disturbing the soil, planting things are common, but the scale varies greatly. Here's another example. This is in the Columbia River Basin. So this is in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And each of those little green circles that you see is a half a mile across. So this is irrigated agriculture in a place that's actually very dry. The rainfall here is about 8 inches per year. So the picture you're looking at might be 40 or 50 miles across. So obviously at a much bigger scale, and these are round irrigation systems, so the sprinkler goes around in a circle. And when you scale this up globally, as I mentioned earlier, this is the footprint of humankind in the way that we use land and water especially. So let's think about an example. Here's another food that I just love. Is pasta with homemade tomato sauce, and sometimes homemade pasta, but not always. But the tomato sauce almost always is something that we make. Now, if it's the middle of winter here where I live in Massachusetts, then I'm probably going to go to the grocery store. I'm probably not going to buy fresh tomatoes. I'm probably going to buy canned tomatoes, which we use a lot of. So when I do that, in all likelihood, the tomatoes in that can are coming from a very highly industrialized system, much of which is in California, but also in Florida. So the picture you see on the lower left has these two little red rectangles in it. Those are truckloads of tomatoes. So this is mechanical harvest. And the picture that you see actually only has 3 people in it. Those people are driving each of those pieces of equipment. So compare that scale to what we saw with the picture from Asia, where it was 2 people working a very small plot of land. Now, when I make my tomato sauce during the summer, in all likelihood, I'm either going to a local farmer's market or a community-supported agriculture that I have a subscription to. And in most cases, getting tomatoes that look very different, like heirloom tomatoes. The scale of agriculture in that situation is much, much smaller. And I'm not pointing out that there's a good scale and a bad scale. There's just different scales, and they have different implications. So you might be wondering, what can you do, or what are things that you should be thinking about if you're interested both in diets that are healthy, but also diets maybe that are better for the planet. And one of the things that you can think about is to start thinking about what are the parts of the system. So this beautiful location that's on this picture, this is in the High Atlas Mountains, so not too far outside of Marrakesh, Morocco. And we visited there in early 2019. And the reason that I use this picture is because it is about a community, but the community is embedded directly in the agriculture and the food system. So there's about 80 families that live here. They're relatively poor. They grow many, many crops, and then they actually meet as a community and decide which crops are grown by whom on which parts of the landscape. So for them, there's no division between the food system and their community that we see often in industrial countries. Another big impact that you can make is to start thinking and then acting to reduce the amount of food that gets wasted. In all different kinds of food systems around the world, the amount of food that gets wasted is somewhere around 30 to 40%, which means all of the resources that went into that food are essentially lost. So this takes some planning, but there are little things that can be done on the level of your household to try to reduce food waste. But you need to think about it and you need to take action with it. Globally, we need to think about technology and how it can both increase the amount of food available, which we are going to need, but also reduce the environmental impact of that food production. So for example, this is another big irrigation system. It doesn't go in a circle, it actually goes in a straight line. This is in south central Nebraska. This is very appropriate technology for Nebraska, which has 8 million acres of irrigation. It's not appropriate technology if you're in Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa. So when we talk about the availability of water and irrigation in different parts of the world, it means different things, and we can't just transplant different technologies. You should also be thinking about the people in the food system. And this is the one place today that I'll mention the pandemic, because the pandemic has shown a pretty harsh light on the way that we treat some people in the food system. So the picture that you see here is people picking lettuce in the Salinas Valley of California. So this is very, very difficult. It's hot, crowded. The people are right next to each other. So during the pandemic, people who work on farms, people who work in, for example, livestock slaughter and processing facilities have basically become hotspots for COVID-19. The other group in the food system that's been dramatically hit by the impact of the pandemic is people that work in restaurants. Again, often immigrant labor, low-paid labor. So it has really shone a light on this issue of how we treat people, and hopefully change will come from that. One of the increasing interests is also the way that we treat animals in the food system. So 10 or 15 years ago, it would be relatively unusual if you went into a grocery store and there would be some kind of rating system that would start to give you an indication of how animals are treated, whether they're chickens or cattle or dairy animals or whatever. This is becoming increasingly important for consumers. And the reason that the system is adjusting to it is because we, the people who buy and eat food, are demanding that the system change. So, don't be afraid to ask questions and speak up if there's parts of this that are troublesome to you in the food system. We do need to be thinking about all parts of the system. A lot of my comments today have been about agriculture, and that's partly because that's where I come from. But the challenges and opportunities go through all parts of supply chains. And we really have this need to build a new food system, and it needs to be one that works for everybody, both in terms of their nutrition, in terms of their food, but also in terms of the work that they do. So I'm really fortunate because at the Friedman School, I get to work with this tremendous group of idealistic young people that are the students that have that as their primary goal. And two examples are shown here. This is Nahela and Sylvia, who won the entrepreneurship contest at the Friedman School for developing an ice cream made from oats. So they built into their model not just does it taste good, but also how does a business like this treat people, and then there are the nutritional aspects of this. So it's a great kind of targeted set of actions that incorporate all of these aspects of sustainability, which includes the people and it includes economics and businesses. So they're developing a suite of products from their company. This is another group of students that I had in a class where they got to develop a new product of their own. It happened to be pasta, which was fantastic. And then they got to do a pitch to the rest of the class. And I bring this up because this is essentially what got me out of the tractor back some 12 years ago and moved to Boston, was to be able to work with students that had this kind of ambition to make positive changes across the food system. And they are the people who can think clearly about what are the connections between the availability of food and, for example, the way that we treat people in the food system. So as you go forward, you can't necessarily change all of your decisions all at once, but you can start to make small changes to be able to take action to improve what you think is important. And it could be people, it could be animals, it could be livelihoods, but any of those are okay. So my parting word to you is think globally and act locally about your food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. So happy to be here with you. And there you are. Hello. So nice to see you. We're live on air. Well, thank you for joining us. And that was a wonderful talk. I really appreciated learning more about your work. I did want to start with a question around the pandemic and how it's shown a harsh light on how we treat some people in the food system. You gave the example of workers in meat processing and packing plants and people who work for low wages in restaurants. I guess the question is, what can not just individuals do, but what would you say are 1 to 2 system changes that you think are going to have a probable impact on this problem? issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Caitlin. And a lot of those issues, those are not new. They're just a lot more visible given the current circumstance in the world. And my comments in my talk were really about what do we as eaters, people who eat, that we're starting to think about that. But the grander scale solutions to this would involve the private sector. Can you build those kinds of things into business models so that it's not just a driver that produces food at the lowest cost and then the most vulnerable people within the food system suffer because of that? The same would be true of governments, and those governments here in the US, it could be multiple layers of government, from municipalities to states to federal government, which could be around wages. It could be about safety in the workplace, whether that is in a processing plant or on a farm. So all of those things, and we think of systematic changes are going to occur in all of those sectors, and they need to. I don't see it necessarily being that we can pass, 3 major laws and that's going to fix and protect all of the people that are involved in the food system. I think it's much broader than that. It is government, certainly, but private sector, and then advocacy, because in a lot of cases, that's what drives political change. And as I mentioned in my talk, when we as consumers speak up, it does change things if enough of us speak up.
Thank you. That was really important. Now we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and keep them coming, audience. We're really happy to get your questions. But this actually came from one audience member, and I think it's an interesting question. What role do you see food distribution companies playing in food equity and sustainability?
I mean, the distribution of food, those companies can serve a lot of different roles. A lot of times we think if it's a very large distribution company, then they only buy food from, larger farms or other businesses that are large. And that's not necessarily the case. There are some models out there where they can serve the function, but actually capture a much broader range of agriculture, which also allows us to have more different types of, for example, from my experience, farming operations and people who run those farms involved. Mm-hmm. So I think there are roles that could be very specific to distribution, so that it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is big. It might be that they're playing a certain function. And once you get across scales of businesses and scales of farms, you're involving a much broader range of diversity among the people that are involved. So I think there is a role there for, in this example, specifically distribution companies. The same would be true of processors or retailers or what have you.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm looking through this chat, and we've got a lot of questions here. There's some questions, Tim, around what we should be eating. And I'm going to actually ask, there's probably 4 or 5 here, but let me ask this one. It's a good one. We've heard so much about, how meat, and specifically cows emitting carbon dioxide, denigrate the environment. Should people eliminate beef from their diets, or are there certain foods that we should just be absolutely eliminating, not only for our individual health, but for the health of the environment and the globe more broadly?
Yes, I've gotten this question before, Kaylon. I don't see it as being that, like, for us, those of us who do research on the food system, or we do research on nutrition, to say that everybody should behave in a very particular way. My point really, and one of my goals, whether it's in research or reaching out to the public, is to get people to think about the choices that they're making. But there's also this factor of, if American diets are not particularly healthy right now, which all of the nutrition and health data would illustrate that they're not particularly healthy. So what are changes that we make? So that's a piece of it. But to say you should be doing those things for one particular reason, I don't find that to be very realistic. And then there's one of the concerns I have is about what's the pathway to change. So if somebody says, let's not eat any beef, or let's not eat any dairy, or let's not eat any strawberries, whatever it is, one of the points I made in my talk is like, there are people involved in this system, right? That are in all parts of that supply chain. And we need to be thinking about what is the impact of those kinds of decisions on the people that do this. It's not only livelihoods, it's culture. It's like, this is what they and their family have been doing for generations. And then to say, no, we should just do away with that. We should always admit our biases, right?
Absolutely.
I always think about like all of the people that I've worked with who are farmers and ranchers, and I have to respect what they do, but we can still make change in that, and we should be having those conversations. So I'm not saying that everybody should eat in a certain way, but please be thinking about what you're eating for multiple reasons.
Yeah. And that's why you're here for us. Thank you, Tim. I have just one other question actually came out, from not just a U.S. centric context. One person writes, I saw Denmark highlighted recently for growing crops indoors and in very small amounts of land with incredibly high yields. Could that work here?
It does work here to some extent already. So we do, the United States is really big physically. Denmark, much less so, and the Netherlands, much less so. They have been very, very successful at growing a huge amount of food in a very controlled environment. So you can't look at that and say, that's not industrialized. It absolutely is, but very low environmental impact. But the crops that they're growing, so if you go to the Netherlands, for example, they grow a lot of bell peppers in the Netherlands, or tomatoes. When we go outside and be able, we're not going to grow wheat in a greenhouse or a glass house, right? So the staple grains that take millions or tens of millions of acres, they're going to continue to be outside. But we could I love the idea of making better use of technology and ecology at the same time, so that we can solve some of those things and produce healthy food. So I don't see those as being contrasting. I see them as being synergistic.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Another question has come up here. It's become increasingly important to consumers to know how animals have been treated in the food production process. This information has become more transparent because we, as consumers, have demanded it. Should we be demanding the same level of transparency about how the people who work on farms or meatpacking plants are treated? Is there any way that we can be more forward-thinking in that space?
Absolutely. The short answer on should we be demanding that and exploring what are the options for how food is produced and how those people are treated within it, then 100%, absolutely, we should be demanding that. And it does, a lot of change is incremental, but I think that, that we as people who eat food, we have some responsibility because we're the demand, right? We are generating the demand. But we should also be thinking about what are not just like if you can afford to buy food, it's not just about which products am I buying and which grocery store do I go to where I live. It's to begin to think about what are all of the other implications to that. I think that's my overriding message is you don't have to think about everything at once, but be conscious about we impact the planet, we impact people, we impact animals, all of those things.
Thank you so much, Tim. I want to just ask you in the 30 seconds that we have left, what's next for you?
Well, this area of research, I've been involved in sustainable agriculture and sustainability since the 80s. That will continue. I work with a lot of students on research on this, doctoral students, master's students. And then my other interest, as I mentioned at the end of my talk, is continuing to help that next generation that can help us address these challenges. We need those people in the room that understand what these connections are. And that's my mission right now.
That's wonderful. And Tim, thank you for your mission and thank you for everything that you're doing for our students and for our university. Wonderful being with you tonight. Thank you.